Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of For What It's Nerd. Today, we are here to discuss Doctor Who's return. Yes, the 60th anniversary, the first of the specials has dropped, and yeah, let's talk about it. I want to preface all this by saying, first off, that I thought generally the return was a good one, and it was a fairly decent episode. It's not my favorite piece of Who media ever created, but I am interested to see where this goes. So, first off, the introduction very much sets this as a new era of Doctor Who, both with the kind of the word that comes to mind is catch up mechanic, which is a gaming term, but I think it kind of makes sense here. This kind of catch up intro, but also kind of it was very interesting because it was the Doctor kind of was outside of the universe for a second in the beginning, but it was kind of interesting to see that because that's the whole point of the Doctor in a sense. He's this outside influence, so to speak, also very knowledgeable at the same time, and all these things. So it was really interesting as a kind of introduction to the Doctor, but also to Donna Noble to kind of get this idea of what's going on with these characters, but from a different perspective to how you might otherwise do so. The one thing I will say is having known they were going to do that, it felt weird when it was then repeated so much within the episode as well. But I don't think that's necessarily like some of it was kind of just how the story went. I get it, but like some of it felt like a little bit repetitive when you kind of had already explained to the audience. The audience didn't need to know twice. But saying that, very nice visuals. I really enjoyed the new title sequence. I love the new logo. I don't know if I've said that previously when I've talked about Doctor Who, this new start to Doctor Who, but I really do like the logo. I think it looks really good. And also just I feel like even though this is a brand new era of Who, it feels like it's really paying homage to more classic Who. It feels like, what this feels like, and it's weird to say, it feels Star Wars-esque. And what I mean by that is classic Who was like the first three films, and then New Who tried to kind of depart from that, right? And it was doing its own thing, but kind of keeping in line with that. And that felt like kind of almost prequel-esque in a sense, right? But now it feels like you're kind of in an era that's trying to kind of cross all of that, right? And bring it all together, because you can start fresh. You can bring in a new audience and give them ideas of what the Doctor is and can be and has been and all that type of stuff. And yeah, so I think in a lot of ways this was really great start to a new era of Who. One thing, of course, that is kind of the prevalent part of this is obviously the return of David Tennant. And I've got to say, I really enjoyed seeing David Tennant as the Doctor again. I think specifically for this story, it was necessary because, yes, you could arguably have had another Doctor, or having either Jodie Whittaker stay in the role for these, or have Ncuti come in early for the role Ncuti Gatwa. But I feel like this story needed to be told. There wouldn't have been a point in telling the story if it wasn't David Tennant and Catherine Tate as the respective characters. So yeah, I think it was really nice seeing them back. They did really well. The chemistry was exactly as I remember it. And there's a lot of interesting parallels in the episode to what happened before, not only on the sense of what had happened between Donna and the Doctor previously, as regards, how Donna basically became part Time Lord in a sense. But that, how do I put it? That it's hard to kind of place the word that I'm looking for. That certain scenes really resonated with the previous tenure of Donna and the Doctor. One specific example, and technically it's not actually even to do with Donna herself, but rather Wilf, Donna's granddad in the show, which is that there's a point where the Doctor and Donna are separated by a glass pane, and for whatever reason, it really reminded me of the end of Ten's run with Wilf and him, and the whole having to basically save Wilf, which causes his regeneration, etc. If I'm remembering that correctly, I hope I am. But so it felt like a very much like a very poetic in a sense, and I feel like that was the intended point of the kind of the splitting of the two by the glass in this episode. I won't go into too much more details about the kind of the spoiler-esque aspect of that, but I did really enjoy those scenes, and I've got to be honest, they were really emotionally heavy, and I felt like regardless of how you feel about the rest of the episode, the pathos between Donna and the Doctor and those moments were really, really good. So that's kind of like the basis that I want to base everything else that we say off. The story. I don't think this is like the best story that Who has ever told, you know. But the thing is, what you have to remember with Doctor Who anyway, and one thing I always try and keep in mind with Who, is that it's kind of like a popcorny thing. Like, don't think into it too much. Don't try and explain things too much. It's never really been that. It's never really done that. Like, if you go back and watch, and I am watching a lot of Classic Who at the moment, if you go back and watch a lot of Classic Who, like, things just happen, and basically it's just because, you know? And that's okay if the show kind of says to you that's what we're going to do, right? So in a lot of ways, don't get me wrong, I'll sit there sometimes and be like, what? But like, that's kind of a Whovian thing, right? It's part of the Whoniverse, as they're now calling it, which is very interesting, by the way, that they've got a brand, kind of an overarching brand for what currently is only one show, because, like, you know, all the spin-offs aren't currently in active development as far as I'm aware. But yeah, so with that in mind, yeah, the story was relatively plain, relatively simple, but I will say I do really like that this story was pulled from prior kind of stories from, I believe, the 90s, if I remember correctly. Might have been earlier. I could be wrong. I did look it up briefly, but essentially the Meep and the Wrath Warriors, the Wrath Warriors, however you want to say it, are pulled from, I believe, comic strips initially, and then some audio dramas, Big Finish audio dramas, which are non-canon when the show kind of contradicts them, but canon otherwise, so to speak. Like a secondary layer of canon, similar to how Star Wars was in the past, or you know, a number of other things, but Star Wars always comes to mind as regards that kind of canon tier. So it's really nice to see that. I actually do always find it very interesting when you take something that hasn't been on screen before and then adapt it for screen and see how people receive it. And, you know, it's funny because I saw a few comments saying, oh, this is like, you know, this isn't like, this is very derivative of XYZ. And I'm like, is it though? Because it existed for quite some time. And, you know, it's always interesting when that kind of comes up, like, oh, well, this was a thing way back in X, Y, and Z. And so that's always interesting. One thing I will say is that I have to address it because it's probably the biggest elephant in the room, this one. There are a lot of topics discussed in this special, in this episode, that are around kind of sexual politics and kind of other politics in that field, and kind of inclusivism and all that type of stuff, right? And so that's great. Don't get me wrong. I think Doctor Who, very similar to Star Trek in this way, by the way, is about that kind of thing, right? It has those kind of thoughtful messages about, you know, what is humanity and what is love, and what is, you know, all those types of things are baked into those types of shows. The sci-fi genre is about what it is to be human, in a sense, right? So very much the case with Doctor Who. and what are people's experiences are, what you know what I mean. I'm not going to keep going over the same words, but I do think that there's been a few controversies around this anyway before this episode, this special came out, because there had been the implication of Davros after the Children in Need special kind of 5-minute episode, so to speak, 5-minute like clip, so to speak, of Davros. Davros no longer being what would constitute a wheelchair user, even though of course he is using Dalek technology to essentially convey himself from place to place, or was previously. That it was the implication that was given as response to that, as the reason for Davros now no longer being a wheelchair user, is that it's essentially that there was a villainizing of it was like ableism, right? And I don't necessarily agree, because I think you can have good and bad people who are able and not not able in certain ways, right? You can have a person who may or may not be blind, for example, who can be a cruel person or a really great person. Like your ability as regards certain things like that does not make you more or less moral, right? And so I felt like that was probably a step in the wrong direction to start, because it implies that implicitly you can only be on a pedestal if you have certain physical or mental detriments or attributes, right? Which is not true. And that kind of minimizes and takes a smaller kind of lens to these issues. People want to be treated normally, they don't want to be edified, so to speak. So with that in mind, this special comes out, and it feels like that's kind of the same kind of, I don't want to say agenda, because I'm really trying to avoid trigger words, like not trigger words, so to speak, but like popular hit words like agenda and like I can't even think of any others off the top of my head now, but you know what I mean. But it feels like the way they're dealing with issues of inclusivism is to tackle them in ways that feel 10 years ago. Does that make sense? It feels like how inclusivism was first tackled all the way back when these issues started to become more prevalent through social media and through a number of other means. It feels like now we're past that, or we're relatively past that, and we had a lot more good representation in media of people who have different levels of ability, different sexual identities, and all that type of stuff, right? And people of color and minority groups, and all those things felt like they were getting to a point where, or feel like to me, I mean, I'm not the best to speak on this, obviously, and I do understand that, and obviously that's part of what I'm trying to say here, I suppose, is that it feels like the way in which these things are being tackled is by an outsider's view, not by someone who is in these situations. And so where I'm going with all of this, because I feel like I have just kind of gone off on a tangent, is to come back around to the dialogue of this episode. And I feel like the dialogue as regards inclusivism was very poor, because it highlighted the idea of inclusivism by talking about the things that would make you not be included. Does that make sense? It wasn't like, oh, there's X character who does Y thing, and that's it. It was X character can't do Y thing because Z. And it was like, that didn't need to be there. Like, you could have removed that, and literally just like the scene would have, first of all, flowed better, and second of all, we didn't need to draw attention to the fact that, like, long story short, there's a part where there's a line about stairs, and we have a wheelchair user in this special, and it feels like there was no need for that, because don't get me wrong, that is a challenge that a lot of people in that circumstance face, and I agree with it. But a lot of these people either get on with it or have their own ways of dealing with it, or in that circumstance would understand that, you know, that's just the way things are, if that makes sense. Or in fact, it wouldn't need to be an apology thing because of XYZ as well. And so what I suppose I'm trying to say is, if you're trying to be inclusive, you should just basically have these people as part of the typical cast, right? As part of the typical, you know, so like there's a character, for example, one great example actually would be Loki season 2. One of the higher members of the TVA, I forget their character's name, but that's kind of superfluous to the point, was a wheelchair user. And in fact, that never played into a single part of the show at any point, but it was great to see that in there, you know. Same with B5 being a black woman. That never became part of the story because it didn't need to in this given show. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think there are shows that need to just dive into all these different kind of how do I put it, social injustices, right? I agree that those things still need to be tackled. I agree that there's still, those stories are still to tell. But in certain circumstances, it's nice just to pretend, like, not pretend, that's maybe the wrong word, but like, it's nice to say, we don't need to worry about that in our universe that we're in right now. You know, if you want to change these things for the better, for more permanently, you want to go at it as if, for example, Star Trek, Utopia, it's the future, things are better, so these issues don't come up. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to produce and promote inclusivism, you do it by essentially silently, in a way, right? I know that sounds very weird, but I just think the way that this episode of Doctor Who went about it was kind of too loud. It was too loud about the fact that it was doing these things. It was almost like, hey, look at us, we're doing this thing, rather than just having it be part of what they're doing. It felt very corporate. It felt very Pride Month advertisements for brands, you know. And a lot of people will know what I mean by that. The idea that during Pride Month, brands all become very, very they become allies, essentially, so that they can sell product, and then at the end of the month they're like, okay, bye, see you guys again next year. So it's a weird one, and yeah, but don't get me wrong, I still think it's great that the inclusivism is there, and I think that actually the two characters they introduced from more minority groups, so to speak, were great. I think they were great, you know, and actually really interesting. But it's just that I think their dialogue sometimes could have been tightened up to not make it so glaring of a thing that the show was trying to do. I think that makes sense, and I hope I've conveyed that point eloquently, because the last thing I want to do is to be insensitive to these issues. I just want to discuss them and talk about how I believe that these things should be tackled in modern media. And if you disagree, that's totally fine. We can have a discourse about that. And if you feel like I'm poorly informed, then let me know that too. I'm more than happy to discuss those things. I'm more than happy to listen to people about their viewpoints. That's the whole point of For What It's Nerd. But I'm just talking through my lens because that's the only one I can talk through. And I hope it's one that is understandable and well put together and is not misconstrued as unfair or unkind or anything like that, because that's not the point of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to talk about media as something that can evolve and be better and do more and be more representative, if anything, just maybe in a better way. But with all that said, I thought it was a very fun, very enjoyable episode of Doctor Who. I'm very excited to see the next special and the one after that. Of course, there is another two, and to see where they go, and also of course, for when Ncuti takes over as the 15th Doctor, and see where that goes too. With all that said, I think we'll leave it there for now, guys. It was a great episode, a great time, and very excited about more Doctor Who. Thank you guys, as always, and I'll see you later.